Mountains don't just kill you with cold or falls or avalanches. Sometimes they get inside your head. At altitudes above 8,000 meters, a zone climbers call the death zone. Your body is dying, even while you're standing still. There isn't enough oxygen up there to keep a human being alive long term. Your organs start shutting down. Your judgment fails. Your brain, starved of oxygen, starts to see things that aren't there, hear things that were never said, and feel presences that don't exist. At least, that's the scientific explanation. Climbers on the world's deadliest peaks have been telling the same stories for over 100 years. A woman left to die in full view of everyone climbing past her. A man who survived the impossible, only to lose everything an arm's length from rescue. And a phenomenon so consistently reported by so many unrelated climbers across a century that scientists finally gave it a name. 3 true stories. Get comfortable, because this one runs the full 15 minutes. And the last story is the one climbers still can't fully explain. Story 1. The sleeping beauty of Everest doesn't just kill people, it keeps them. Above 8,000 meters, on the main route to the summit, there's a stretch of trail climbers have nicknamed Rainbow Valley. It isn't named for anything beautiful. It's named for the brightly colored jackets of the dead scattered across the ice, permanently frozen in place. Because at that altitude, in that cold, bodies don't decompose, they don't get buried. Recovery is often impossible. They simply stay exactly where they fell, for years, sometimes decades, in full view of every climber who passes. In May 1998, an American climber named Francys Arsentiev set out to become the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. No tanks, no mask, nothing but her own lungs against the thinnest air on Earth. She was climbing with her husband, Sergei, a highly experienced Russian mountaineer. They reached the summit, but the climb had taken far longer than planned, and by the time they began their descent, night had fallen over the mountain. Francys was exhausted, disoriented, and suffering from severe altitude sickness. Somewhere in the dark, on a mountain where a single wrong step means death, she and Sergei became separated. The next morning, 2 climbers from another expedition, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd, were making their own summit attempt when they found her. Frances was lying in the snow, barely conscious, her skin already blackened with frostbite. But she was alive. Her eyes were open, and as the 2 climbers knelt beside her in the thin, screaming wind, she began to speak. The same words over and over, in a voice that Woodall later said he would never forget. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me." Here is the part of this story that still turns climbers' stomachs today. Above 8,000 meters in the death zone, a rescue is nearly impossible. There is no helicopter that can fly that high. There is no stretcher, no team of medics. Carrying an unconscious adult down a near vertical wall of ice, while your own body is dying from lack of oxygen, will very often kill the rescuer as well as fail to save the victim. Woodall and O'Dowd tried. For nearly an hour, in conditions that were actively freezing their own bodies, they attempted to move her, to warm her, to get her breathing steadier. It didn't work. She was already too far gone, and the terrain gave them no way to carry her down. They made a decision that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They left her there and continued down the mountain, because staying any longer would have meant 3 deaths instead of 1. Francys Arsentiev died alone on that ledge, in the exact spot where they left her. Her husband Sergei, it turned out, had climbed back up into the death zone that same night to search for her, driven back into the storm by nothing but love and desperation. He never found her. He fell to his death somewhere on the route, and his body was recovered lower down the mountain. For 9 years, Francys's body remained exactly where she died, directly on the main climbing route to the summit. Every single climber attempting Everest from the north side had to walk within feet of her to reach the top. Her blue-green jacket, frozen and weathered by 9 years of wind and ice, had faded to a pale color that made her look almost peaceful, almost asleep. Guides and Sherpas started calling her Sleeping Beauty. Climbers who passed her described something they couldn't shake: a wave of guilt, stepping over a woman's frozen body to chase their own summit photo. Several climbers reported something stranger. At night, camped near that stretch of the route, they described hearing a faint whispering carried on the wind. Words they couldn't quite make out, always coming from the direction of where she lay. Others said they felt distinctly that someone was pacing beside them as they walked that section of trail, matching their footsteps exactly, staying just out of the edge of their vision. In 2007, a climbing expedition finally moved her body off the main route, out of sight of passing climbers, at the request of her family. But guides on Everest still tell new climbers her story before they go, not as folklore, but as a warning and a rule that every mountaineer learns the hard way. Above a certain altitude, no matter how close the other climbers are, you are completely on your own. Story 2. The death of Toni Kurz. If Everest is famous for altitude, the Eiger in the Swiss Alps is famous for something far more immediate: sheer, merciless vertical rock. Locals have a nickname for its north face: Mordwand, the murder wall. In the summer of 1936, 4 young climbers set out to make one of the first ascents of the Eiger's north face. 2 Germans, Toni Kurz and Andreas Hinterstoisser, and 2 Austrians, Willi Angerer and Edi Rainer. The climb went wrong almost immediately. Partway up the wall, the team reached a horizontal stretch of blank, holdless rock that blocked their path completely. Hinterstoisser solved it with a technique that would later be named after him: the Hinterstoisser Traverse. Swinging himself across the rock on a fixed rope to reach climbable terrain on the other side. It worked. The team crossed. Then the weather turned, and one of the climbers was injured by falling rock. The team made the only reasonable decision: retreat. They needed to cross back over that same blank traverse to reach their original route down. And that's when they made the mistake that would kill 3 of them. To save time, they pulled the fixed rope down behind them as they retreated, not realizing until it was far too late that they would need it again to recross that same impossible stretch of rock. Without it, the traverse became nearly unclimbable. Trapped, injured, and now facing a full storm, the team tried to descend anyway. An avalanche of falling ice and rock swept down the face and hit them directly. Hinterstoisser fell to his death instantly. Angerer was killed in the same avalanche. Some accounts say he was strangled by his own rope as the falling ice yanked it tight around his neck. Rainer froze to death where he hung, still clipped into the rock face, unable to move, unable to help himself or anyone else. That left Toni Kurz alone, hanging from a rope on a wall so steep, his body simply dangled in open air, roughly 1,800 meters, nearly 6,000 feet, above the valley floor, with the bodies of his 3 friends scattered above and below him on the rock. Rescuers on the ground could actually see him. A team of local mountain guides launched an extraordinary rescue attempt, climbing up through an old maintenance tunnel that ran through the inside of the mountain, used for a railway, to reach a small window cut into the rock face, close enough to shout across the open air to him. And Kurz answered. He was alive. He had survived an entire night hanging on that wall in freezing wind, one arm completely frozen and useless from frostbite, watching his 3 friends die around him one by one. The rescuers below threw him a line. Working with only one functioning hand, in temperatures that were actively freezing the flesh on his body, Kurz spent hours, tying a series of knots to splice together the rope from his dead teammates so he could lower it down to the rescuers and attach a stronger rescue line to himself. It was slow, agonizing, one-handed work thousands of feet above the ground, with his own body filling more with every passing minute. At one point, in a hoarse, broken voice that the guides below never forgot, he said simply, "I'm finished." But he kept working. He got the rescue rope attached. He began lowering himself inch by inch toward the men reaching up for him. He was close. Close enough that the guides could see his face clearly. Close enough to call out encouragement. Close enough to almost touch him. And then, the rope jammed, caught on one of the knots Kurz himself had tied hours earlier. Just meters, just a few feet, above the outstretched hands of the men trying to save him. He tried to free it. He couldn't. His one working hand no longer had the strength or the coordination left after everything his body had endured. The rescuers watched, helpless, as Toni Kurz, after surviving the impossible, after outliving his entire team, after hours of one-handed rope work in conditions that should have killed him 10 times over, finally lost consciousness and died, hanging there, arm's length from the men who had come to save him. To this day, mountaineers describe the Eiger's North Face as one of the most psychologically heavy climbs in the world. Not because of ghosts exactly, but because of the sheer, undeniable weight of stories like this one. Some guides who work that section of the mountain still say they feel watched near the spot where Kurz died, and more than a few refuse to linger there longer than they have to. Story 3. The Third Man, 1115 to 1415. This last story isn't about one person. It's about a phenomenon reported by dozens of climbers, explorers, and survivors across more than a century, on completely different mountains, continents apart, with no way any of them could have influenced each other's accounts. Researchers now call it the third man factor. It works like this. A person is alone, or with only one companion, in an extreme survival situation, freezing, exhausted, starved of oxygen, close to death, and they become utterly convinced there is someone else there with them, a silent presence, walking beside them, guiding them, somehow keeping them moving forward when every part of their body is telling them to stop and lie down in the snow. The phenomenon gets its name from a line in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, which was directly inspired by a real account from the explorer Ernest Shackleton. In 1916, after his ship Endurance was crushed and sunk by Antarctic ice, Shackleton and two of his crew were forced to cross the mountain and glaciers of South Georgia Island on foot. A desperate 36-hour trek with no food, no proper equipment, and no margin for error to reach a whaling station and bring back help for the rest of his stranded crew. All three men survived, and afterward, separately, without prompting each other, all three admitted the same thing. They had each felt, the entire way, that there was a fourth person walking with them. None of them had said anything about it during the crossing. They only discovered they'd shared the exact same experience once they compared notes afterward. It didn't stop there. Mountaineers have reported almost identical experiences ever since on completely unrelated expeditions. Frank Smythe, a British climber attempting Everest alone in 1933, described the presence beside him so vividly that at one point he broke off a piece of the mandarin cake he was eating and turned to offer it to his climbing companion. Before catching himself and remembering, with a jolt, that he was completely alone on the mountain. Reinhold Messner, widely considered the greatest high-altitude climber in history, the first man to summit Everest without bottled oxygen, described an almost identical experience during his descent from Nanga Parbat in 1970, a descent during which his brother Gunther was killed in an avalanche. Messner said he felt an invisible third climber beside himself and his brother, matching their pace the entire way down. Everest climbers today report the same thing constantly in the death zone. A persistent sense that there's one more person in their group than there actually is. A voice calling their name from somewhere close by when no one else is around. A hand that seems to steady them on a narrow ledge at the exact moment they start to lose their balance. Scientists have an explanation for this, and it's a reasonable one. At extreme altitude, combined with exhaustion, cold, dehydration, and isolation, the human brain can begin to malfunction in specific, predictable ways. And one of those ways may be inventing a companion, essentially hallucinating a helper to keep a person moving and fighting for survival instead of giving up. That explanation makes sense. Mostly. Except for the details that keep repeating, almost word for word, across accounts from people who never met each other, separated by decades and oceans. The presence is described the same way nearly every time. Calm, silent, walking just behind or just beside the climber, never speaking a word, but somehow felt as unmistakably protective. Climbers who by every rational measure should have died alone in the snow with no one anywhere near them to help. Describe being guided, step by step, choice by choice, back down to safety by someone who, as far as anyone can tell, was never actually there. So, the question climbers still ask each other, huddled in tents at altitudes where the human body isn't meant to survive, is this: is the third man just the brain, doing whatever it takes to keep itself alive? Or is there something in that thin freezing air above 8,000 meters that reaches out specifically for the people who are truly, completely alone? 3 stories, 3 mountains, a woman left in full view of the very route she died on, watched by strangers for 9 years, a man who survived the impossible, only to lose everything meters from the hands reaching for him, and a phenomenon that has followed climbers into the death zone for over a century, reported the same way, again and again, with no explanation that fully accounts for it. The mountains don't need monsters. Altitude, cold, isolation, and the human mind pushed past its limits are more than enough on their own. If this video kept you up tonight, hit subscribe. I post true horror stories like this every week. And tell me in the comments, do you think the third man is just the brain fighting to survive, or something else entirely? See you in the next one.